So welcome to another video from theplayersaid.com. My name's Alexander, and today we're taking a look at another book. We're doing another book review. And I think this series at this point might be called From Cover to Cover, which was a suggestion by Russ Wetley of Cardboard Conflicts. I was asking, and there was lots of good suggestions, but I'm always a big fan of something that's both kind of a pun, but also relevant, and that's like kind of like haha the first time, and then every time after that you just don't, you're not, it's not like a joke every time, kind of like it just becomes a name at that point. That's kind of where the Players Aid came from. The first time I'm like, oh, okay, and then after that it's like it's just the name of the blog. Okay, so anyway, so welcome to the latest episode of From Cover to Cover. We'll see if it sticks. I think it will. So today we're taking a look at a book called D-Day by Stephen E. Ambrose. And if you don't know who Stephen E. Ambrose is, where have you been? He is probably most famous for a book that he wrote called Band of Brothers, after which there was an HBO television show made that is one of the greatest TV shows of all time within the kind of war and historical kind of genre. Might just be of all time, frankly, because the characters are so engaging and the acting is so good and the production value is almost always off the charts. But I digress. That's so that I think is his most famous book. However, he's written a lot of books, and so I had an opportunity to kind of get a hold of this, which is funny because I read Band of Brothers probably when I was like, I don't know, 15 or 16. And then I also read Wild Blue, which is about U.S. bombers in, I believe it was 8th Air Force. I could be wrong about that. It's been a long time. But I remember it being extremely good. And it was very much in that same style, where it was, interviews of people and things like that, and kind of stitched those together with a narrative. And it was, I remember that being really good, very different from Band of Brothers in the sense of what they kind of went through and the different experiences that they had, as you might imagine. So, all of that to say, I'd read those two as a kid, and then I bought D-Day, and that must have been like, I don't know, in like 2006, and I never read it. It just languished on a shelf, and then when I moved to the US, I basically donated a lot of books to friends, and then just kind of gave the rest to charity shops. So I'd had it at one point, never read it. I think I gave Grant an Ambrose book for one of his birthdays or something one year. He's got a bunch on lots of different cool topics. So I would recommend having a dabble if you've not. But anyway, all that to say, this is like a 600-page tome on D-Day. And D-Day is one of the most war games topics out there. It's like D-Day, Bulge, and Barbarossa. Everyone's got one of those. Or some people have all three. And I'm talking like designers there almost. So, I'd not read anything I've not read anything on it. I'm going to say that. We all know what happens on D-Day. Lots of movies. They reference The Longest Day a couple times in this book even. We've all watched Saving Private Ryan, and those first 25 minutes of that is kind of like really big in the cultural zeitgeist. That's like one of the most famous pieces of film from the last 25 years. Because it's so intense. And I think that's, there's lots of old Hollywood war films where it's a little bit more sanitized, and that kind of was like, oh, this is really intense, and this is what people went through. And this book, conducted through a lot of oral histories, as well as written ones, by Ambrose, is kind of a culmination of all of that, and it's a very intense book in that way. It's a lot of veterans remembering their times of that, but also there's stuff like notes and letters from that were very current, and the differences between some of those two things are very interesting in this book. What I would say is this is a 600-page book. This is probably the fastest 600-page book I've ever read. I read a good amount, and this took me about a month, is what I would say. And I could have done it quicker, but we had a bunch of conventions and stuff. But it's one of those books that just goes very quickly because it's very, very engaging. Now, that's not to say it's the perfect book. It is what I would term it. This is a very good overview of the American actions on D-Day and an extremely brief and very shallow look at the Commonwealth actions and everyone else on D-Day. It's got a couple of issues in it. He like repeats himself on different pages, and it almost in like a Dickensian way. But I love Dickens, and I don't like it in this. It seems like different pages were serialized. He'll use like the exact same sentence and almost paragraph like 2 pages later, like he's repeated himself. A couple of weird bits and pieces like that. Contradicts himself in a couple places. Like he's talking about the Canadians landing on their beaches, and he talks about the disaster of Dieppe in 1942, and it's like he describes kind of very briefly what went on there, and it was like the Canadians landed with a 2-to-1 force advantage, which isn't nearly enough. There wasn't any pre-shore naval bombardment, there wasn't any air bombardment and all this stuff, and the shingle at Dieppe was no good for tanks or anything like that. And then, so he talks about all of this stuff, and that's why it was a disaster, and then he says, like, the very next paragraph he says, oh, and the only lesson that was learned from Dieppe was don't attack a port from head on. And it was like, what? Because he spent the whole like beginning of the book talking about the intelligence gathering, the reconnaissance, the massive naval bombardments that went on before D-Day, all of the air bombardments as well, the huge force increase, something like 7-to-1, even more than that. And he's talked about all of that in detail, and then says, but the Canadians didn't learn any lessons from it, effectively. And it was like, what? You just talked about all this stuff. So there was bits of it where like, I don't know if he was just rushing at the end, and it was like very strange at times. But generally speaking, when he's talking about stuff he knows about, which is very obvious when he's just kind of talking about a topic, and when he's talking about an area of his expertise, very, very good. Because he worked as a director and a curator for the Eisenhower Center, I think is what it's called, and it was through that he was collating all these, interviews, conducting all those, getting all the first-hand sources together and stuff like that, and that's why he's got such an expertise on some of these things and such a personal one, which that's the best part of this book, is the individual accounts that represent some of the larger kind of experiences. And some of them are picked out because they have almost like a crazy humor to them, and some of them because they have like a real great tragedy and a kind of intense disaster to them, and other ones, great bravery and things like that. And you have to understand, in a book like this, you pick out some of those highlights, so to speak, to represent larger actions. While lots of people did this kind of a thing, lots of people had a similar type of experience, not quite like this, but that's what they had. And so you're kind of taking the little and applying it to the lot. And there's a lot of that in this, but those accounts, I think that's what I really enjoy when I'm reading history, is the real, boots on the ground, the personal stuff. I think that's the most interesting part of a lot of, especially modern books like this, because you just don't have that kind of thing when it comes to ancient history or even some of the older stuff. Even medieval stuff, it's hard to get the level of detail that we can today with all of our recording and kind of bookkeeping and note-taking that we do. So I'm really grateful that we have that, and that part of it is really excellent. But yeah, there's like 3/4 of this book is about U.S. actions, and then there's like a chapter on each of Gold Sword and Juno kind of at the end. So just understand, this is a U.S. author writing for a U.S. audience, and it is very good for that. But if you want more detail about some of the other things, you're going to have to look elsewhere. Now, one of the things I really loved about this book is that it had the opening few chapters. You know, he talked a little bit kind of about the strategic situation, which most of us war gamers kind of already know about. But if you don't, it's a very good introduction. And it's, you know, talks about the command structure of SHAFE, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Talks about where some of those kind of ranking officers had come from in their careers, which is, you know, that's always interesting. Some of their relationships, which is, famously they talk about Patton and Eisenhower and Monty, and how everyone really didn't get on very well. And most of that is kind of laid at the feet of a certain British general, but there's all sorts. There's all sorts of things that go on, and he doesn't go into too much detail with those things because that's like books and tomes on their own. But it gives you a really good overview of that. And then the stuff that really excites me, and I thought was very interesting, is he talks about the industrial might behind D-Day. So Andrew Higgins, who designed the Higgins boat, all of the work and labor and design and ingenuity that went into those kinds of things, all of the deception operations to dupe the Germans into where D-Day was going to happen. Love that stuff. I've always thought that kind of stuff was fascinating, and it just goes into really good detail about that. Talks a little bit about, very briefly, kind of about the Enigma code breakers and that kind of aspect of it. Talks a little bit about French resistance, just all these little bits and pieces. Talks about getting the Navy together for the naval preparations, all of the RAF and US Army Air Force preparations with the various bombing campaigns that were done to isolate the kind of the Normandy area by cutting all the bridges and railroads and things like that. I love all of that. And it's kind of like the pre-battle stuff, and part of that's because play a lot of war games. We do the battle stuff. And so learning about the stuff that precedes that, the stuff that can't make it into the game, is really fascinating, and I really appreciate in a book. And he does a good job of introducing a lot of that stuff. Some of it's in really good detail. Other of it, you're like, ooh, I could read even more about that. And that's that's where I'm going from this, is some further reading. So that some of those aspects of it were really, really good. But generally speaking, this is an extremely readable book. This is written for you and I. This is not written for academics. And as such, the style is very talkative. He's got a good way with words when he needs to have, and the rest of it he kind of leaves up to the kind of the first-hand accounts and the veterans. And I think he does that. I think that's Ambrose's greatest strength, is knowing when to kind of shut up and to let the accounts do the talking. He's kind of a master at that. He'll kind of say something and it'll go straight into like a story told, and it all flows really well. Most of that stuff is just sublime to read. It's such a quick read. You just go through it because you've got chapters on all the pre-stuff, and then it's like boom, we've got a couple chapters on 101st Airborne and 82nd Airborne and all of their dealings, so to speak, and then you go straight to the division. Is it 4th? Oh no, 4th Infantry Division landing at Utah. If it's not, I'm so sorry. And then and it's like that their whole day's journey, and that's two or three chapters. And then once that kind of goes to a lull, you go straight back to 0600, and it's 116th Infantry Regiment at Omaha, and you stick with them for a few chapters, and then it kind of comes to a close. Then it's boom, you're thrown into 5th Rangers at Pont du Hoc, and so the book has these you build up, everyone lands, everything kind of goes crazy, and then you get these really personal moments of bravery and courage and everything in between, and then and then things kind of get sorted out, and there's maybe some kind of a conclusion, or at least kind of an end point for the story at least, and then you're just thrown right back into that again from a different perspective at a different beach, things like that. It's got a really good flow to it, really readable, and like I said, one of the fastest 600 pages of history I think I've ever read as such, because it's not casual as such, but this is meant to be approachable and readable, and it is. And I know a lot of people who have read this who love it. So, all that being said, I want to talk about a few different games to pair with this. And the list could be exhaustive. There is a trillion D-Day games. I wanted to talk about a few because, there's too many to cover. So the first things that I wanted to talk about are kind of what you might expect, the classic solitaire game from Decision Games, D-Day at Omaha Beach. There are a couple of very dedicated chapters with some pictures and good maps in here. Simple maps, but good, clear maps about 116th Infantry Regiment landing at Omaha. You do all of that in this game. This is a solitaire-only game, and it's designed by John Butterfield. This is a classic. It's been around for a long time. It's gone through a number of different editions. I love this game. Punishing, crippling, so difficult to do, and you get a sense of some of the chaos and the withering fire that they were put under when you play this game. Like, the first thing you do in this game is you launch the tanks from the landing, the LCTs, and they all immediately just get washed down to shore. Like, I think they all go west. They all get with the tide, and almost none of them ever make it to the beach. And it's just like, oh no, this is very bad from the very beginning. Then you land all your first wave of troops, and the thing that I really, really liked about this game is that the hexes have these little color-coded markers on them, which indicate the fields of fire from which casements and kind of Widerstand nester that they can be attacked from. And Ambrose does a really good job of explaining that. Like, the guns weren't pointing towards the ocean. The guns were pointed across the beaches and they were covered from naval fire so that they could just rake the beaches and the shoreline. That's what they did. And you really feel it in this game. It's a very, very intense game, very popular game, been around for a long time. And you can get you kind of, there's two sets to it. You do the kind of like the first initial D-Day landings, like the beach landings, and it's kind of established, you just get off the beach. And then it's the going the kilometer and a half inland, and taking out the larger emplacements. You can go further into doing that as well. But this is an excellent place to start. If you've never played a D-Day game, this is a great place to start. You can't go wrong with this, basically. And again, everything you do in that is covered in this book. The other game that I wanted to talk about, slightly on the very different style of game, is Crowbar, the Rangers at Pont du Hoc. So this is from Flying Pig Games, and again, whole chapter on the Rangers at Pont du Hoc. And I played this before I'd read the book, and so in playing this, there's some notes and stuff, and you're like, oh, okay, cool, that's kind of what they do. And you play, this is kind of a die smasher, push your luck style game. And then reading about it, you're like, oh, that's why the kind of the rocket propelled grappling hooks are so bad in this game. You miss them almost every single time. It's really hard to get them to go, because in reality, I think they had like 3 that were successful, if that. And they're just scaling this cliff, and then the kind of the chaos that was up there with the fortified manor house and all the trenches. Very, very, very interesting. But this game is a little bit lighter there. Also a solitaire-only game. I think there's a lot of solitaire games about D-Day, because it's like, who wants to sit there and play stack defenses? No one wants to do that. This was a really enjoyable game, very different kind of war game. But again, this is very explicitly tied to the Rangers chapter in here, which was frankly one of the most interesting, and how they were very isolated for a very long time and had to hold out with very little and withstood a number of different counterattacks with almost no ammunition. It was just a very, very cool part of the book, and a fun game to go along with that as well. Let's see, what else we got? One of the other games that I've got is kind of a classic, Memoir 44. And before everyone switches off and poo-poos it, some people might be playing this, hey, I've read a book and here's a game about it. Well, for a lot of people who aren't wargamers, this is the game that they're going to get. This is what you should buy. Now, there's a lot of other non-D-Day scenarios in this, because you have this board and you put terrain tiles on it. But this has all of your 101st and 82nd Airborne landings in it. You have all of that pre-invasion stuff going on. There are at least 2 or 3 beach landing D-Day scenarios in it. Now, there's a ton more, but I think for the more casual people who aren't as hardcore into some of these other games, this is a wonderful place to start. Let me hold that upside down for you. I've got the box on backwards, but Memoir 44 is both a really good, fun, light introductory game, but also has a great focus. I know for a fact there's Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, there's taking of Sam Eric Lee's. All of this stuff is in there that you're going to read about in some of the chapters in this. So that's a really nice place to start. We've got a number of other kind of World War II tactical games, but not that many have stuff about kind of D-Day per se. Again, very light fare, but also very enjoyable. So a couple other games I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to start with this. So we'll start with Fortress Europa. And this is the designer signature edition of DSE, which came out from Compass Games a few years ago. This game is really enjoyable. This is a much bigger hex and counter war game, big 2-mapper. Now, we're going to whine and complain because this is about so much more than D-Day. You're doing basically the whole of France. So this game has a much larger scale, but look at the front cover. The D-Day that you do is going to set the tone for the campaign of this game. And what I mean by that is, and what I really enjoyed about this game, I think Grant would say the same thing too, is that you get to decide where you can conduct D-Day, and so like you have this whole planning stuff, all of this pre-invasion stuff. Depending on where you land, you'll have a different force composition. If you can do the landings historically, you can do them in Normandy, and you'll have the same kind of force composition that you would have done. But if you focus in the south, well, there were fewer troops. You don't need as many, so it's still kind of balanced. But the thesis is also getting everyone all the way round France through Bay of Biscay and all that into the Med, and then across. They just logistically couldn't bring as much stuff. It was not physically possible. You can do the landings near Brest. You can do them at the Pas de Calais. There's all these different landing zones that you can choose to do, and I think that's really neat to explore some of that stuff, because different landing options are discussed in this book, and they kind of say, oh, no to this, no to that, no to this, but you can choose to try it. And that's one of the really great things about this game. You also have really cool strategic air war stuff. It's choosing to bomb the railways, to cut the lines so that reinforcements come, or do you how much do you commit to protect the bombers, or for close air support to kind of gun down the panzer divisions coming for counterattacks on the beaches. All of that stuff is in here, and it was just very, very enjoyable, and I really, really like this game because it's got all that, but it's still a pretty clean game. And this is the newest edition. But I remember we just kind of played it, and it played really well. Very difficult, but played really well. So this is a big one. It's much more than just D-Day, but the D-Day part of it is so important, and it gives you so many options that I think this pairs well. And this is also, you get just one day of history. This book is a primer for all the other books you're going to read on that. This game is also going to give you everything else on top of that as well, which is that's a great boon. I think the last thing that I've got here to talk about that I've played is, so I've got Raid on St. Nazaire. This is an old Avalon Hill game. Now, obviously this isn't an EDA game. However, there was a game based on this system, which is kind of it's a solitaire point-to-point movement game, and it was called Pegasus Bridge, and it was in an issue of Strategy and Tactics. I actually made a review of that a very long time ago. Fairly simple system. Pegasus Bridge being the very first action of the Allied invasion. So it's you've got a company of it's a parachute infantry company of the Oxford and Bucks I believe, and I think it's 6th Airborne. So it's them. You literally, here's my little 3 gliders. I think it was 3, and you have to land them, and then you debark your troops, and you have to go and take Pegasus Bridge. And it's a very simple, kind of neat game. If you have the opportunity to get it, it's kind of worth a go. I did subsequently sell it. I just don't have the space for every single game. And after I'd played it a few times, that one was kind of done, because I'm keeping this. This is the same system, but it's kind of a bit beefier because it's a full box game, and this is kind of just a bit more intense. Pegasus Bridge is very focused and it doesn't have the same replay value, but that's a really neat game. I also have on the table here a game that I wish to play, which is actually about the same thing. It's called Night Drop 2. This is the map for it. Beautiful game. Haven't played it, but this is a hex encounter game covering the exact same action as that S&T game. But it just looks, it's beautiful, the counters are great, the artwork's great, and at some point I will get to this as well, because I just think some of these smaller actions that supported D-Day, I think some of that stuff's really interesting. Reading about the British paras taking some of the large kind of artillery batteries, really, really interesting stuff. Charging head-on across minefields, across barbed wire, to save the lives of those men who would be, debarking from troop carriers later. Just some of it's incredible, and I think highlighting some of that stuff's really, really neat. Another game that I've got here, again unplayed, but is very much in the queue, is Normandy 44. This one's a little bit more of those first things. I think this one goes all the way to June 27th, but the landings and establishing the beachhead and maintaining that and breaking out, that's the whole point of this game. So they're a significant portion of this game. This is part of Mark Simonich's 40X series, which is both an excellent series generally, but also this is a one-mapper. If you're a bit more, want to dive into something a bit more hardcore, this and Fortress Europa are probably the 2 most intense games that we could talk about today. But haven't played this one, been around for 10 years, and this has gone through a number of editions and printings. It's very popular, and so at some point we will get to this as well. And then what I don't have is, Grant has Day of Days, which is, it's the standard combat system, SCS from MMP. SCS is an incredible system, love it. Day of Days is like a monster out of that. It's 4 maps, it's all the landings, it's all the airborne drops beforehand. Huge game. We don't have the space for it, he's got it. Eventually we're going to get ourselves a bigger table, and at some point I would like to play it. But that one's that one's a bit more kind of further off in the future. We didn't talk about things like The Dark Summer, which is Ted Racer's The Dark series, because that's a bit more, that's like the whole of the Normandy campaign, which I know we talked about Fortress Europa is, but the landings in The Dark Summer are almost an afterthought. Like they have no bearing on the rest of the game. You could only land in one space, and there's only one possible thing that could go wrong, basically. And a turn in that is weeks, and so you just kind of set it up, and then you kind of stop thinking about it at that point. There's not really that same focus that you get in a lot of the other games that we talked about. So all in all, D-Day is one of those topics that there is a ton of games about. I mean, there's a million that I haven't even talked about. These are just the ones that kind of we have and have played or will play. So let me know what your favorite D-Day games are, and if there's something that we're kind of missing, or what we should kind of look into as well. I would recommend reading this book, especially if you're from our American audience. This will be right up your alley. But it does leave me a little bit wanting more with kind of coverage of Commonwealth actions. And you know, they talk about the Norwegian destroyers and some of the Polish actions, Free French guys landing, 10 Commando, I think it is. I think, is it 3rd Troop 10 Commando was a commando unit of Jewish volunteers. Like, they talk about it a little bit and go into a couple of the stories of the guys, but I'm like so fascinated by it that I have added to my wish list. There's a book specifically about that called 10 Troop, which I would love to read more about. These kind of more general books, there's some specifics in it, but boy, these are a springboard into a lot of other further reading. So if you're interested and you haven't read this, I would heartily give it a go. I've read 2 of his other books, and as a general rule, I'd probably recommend any of them. If they're anything like the 3 that I've read, the worst thing you're going to get is an enjoyable read, you know? So he's one of the most popular kind of US pop historians that there is for a reason, at least from his writing standpoint. So check this out if you're interested. Hopefully we've kind of talked about a couple games to maybe get you inspired to read this book, or if you've read this book and you've never played a war game, a couple other bits and pieces that you might look into to kind of interact with the history, to replay some of it, to get to grips with why certain things, you know, they talk about all of the traffic jams on the beaches. Well, you'll get to play that in some of these, and you'll understand why, because getting guys off can be very difficult. So anyway, I appreciate you very much for tuning in. If you like the series, let us know in the comments. If you want to see more of this kind of thing, or if you totally hate it, just say you hate it, and that's totally fine. And I also won't listen, and I'll continue to do them. But appreciate you tuning in to another episode of Cover to Cover, or From Cover to Cover, that's what we're calling it. I've been Alexander from ThePlayerSaid.com.